Thanks for being part of this Saturday presentation. This talk is about Cunningham in general and one particular Cunningham, which is the one that I own, which is number 5207. So this will either be the most boring conversation you'll ever be a part of, or if you're like me, I love minutia and drilling down into kind of the history of a car and mining whatever gold there might be. So so this presentation probably will last an hour or so, and as Bill said, you can send him questions and then he'll ask me in real time, or you can wait until the end. But I have, as he said, I have all morning and actually all afternoon. I could keep you here until dinner time, but I won't. So, here's a picture of the car. This is soon after I acquired it, and the Ferrari Club in Palm Beach, Florida, puts on a big Ferrari event every year, and invited Cunninghams to come down there for one event because the bodies were made in the same plant as many Ferraris, which is Vignale. And so this body was made by Vignale in Torino, Italy, and actually looks very much like a probably a plus 20% size 212 1952 Ferrari. Next to each other, they look virtually identical, except the Cunningham, of course, is much larger because of the Hemi engine. So you're gonna learn more about this car than you'll ever want to know, and about Cunningham in general. This, by the way, this photo was taken at, I'm not going to get political, this was taken at the Mar-a-Lago estate in about 2008, I believe. So Briggs Cunningham was a member of what I call the Lucky Sperm Club. Briggs was born into a wealthy family in Cincinnati, Ohio. His father was a banker and invested in a company owned by two young gentlemen. One last name was Proctor and the other one was Gamble. And they had invented a bar of soap that floated, as we all know, as ivory soap. And so the family made a fortune. Briggs was always interested in going fast. He promised his mother that he would not race, and he upheld that promise until she passed away. And he started racing at an age where some people would have considered retiring. This was the first race that he didn't drive in this race, but he owned the car, his first race car, and they called it a Buick. It was a Buick chassis with a straight 8 engine, with a Mercedes body that he had found in a junkyard, an SSK body mounted on that chassis, which was narrowed. And this was racing at the 1939-1940 New York World's Fair. It was a kind of a rinky-dink little course in a parking lot, but so that was his before World War II. This was his first moments in the auto racing realm. He was part of the AACA, which is the ARCA, Auto Racing Club of America, with the Collier brothers, and they formed this group, and it was usually small sports cars that raced around, believe it or not, the Collier family compound in Westchester, New York, on the driveways of that estate, and they actually held races there. They were before World War II. Well, after World War II, the group got back together again, and they decided Le Mans was probably a neat place to race sports cars. So Briggs initially wanted to race cars called Fordilacs, which were shoebox Fords, 1949-50 Ford with a Cadillac motor that were converted by Bill Frick of Frick Tappet Motors in Freeport, Long Island. The Le Mans organizers liked that idea, but it kind of didn't apply to their rules because the engine came from General Motors, the bodies came from Ford, it was not homologated correctly. So they disallowed it. So what Briggs did was buy a couple of Cadillacs and race those in the 1950 Le Mans. So you see the second car, number 3, is a stock body Cadillac. It had a V8 engine with a 3-speed column on the column. And then the front car is, believe it or not, the same car as the one behind it, except Grumman Aerospace engineers from Bethpage, New York, moonlighted and created this ungainly looking sports car, aerodynamic sports car body. And I think it had 5 carburetors on it, if I'm not mistaken. Back then, you could not get a 4-barrel. So the way you increased the fuel intake was to add carburetors. And so I think that one had 5 carburetors. Interestingly, in 1950, the number 3 car finished 10th, and the number 2 car, that's a French 2, finished 11th. So these 2 cars, basically showroom stock Cadillacs, finished 10th and 11th, which was an amazing first go at it. And it gave Briggs the kind of the impetus to, oh, I'm going to start building my own cars. I'll homologate them, and we'll go racing. So they built the C1, which was a Cadillac powered car, and after that, the C1 was just a road going car. Cadillac decided they had no benefit in supplying engines to a racing operation because they wanted to sell their cars as luxury cars. And so Briggs built his own cars with Chrysler Motors. He at Yale, he was a roommate to a vice president at Chrysler Corporation, and the new Hemi, 331 cubic inch, same size as the Cadillac, 331 cubic inch. He started to build his own cars with Hemi engines. And virtually all his cars up through 1955 had Hemi engines in them. So this is the most famous and successful of the racing Cunninghams. By the way, Cunninghams were relatively short run cars. They built 36 cars in total, which includes 27 street cars. So really short run. That meant 9 race cars in total were built. So this is the C4R, and they built actually 2 of these. Here's the C4RK, which was only one of these was built. And this is at Watkins Glen in 1952. And just they had a display in town, and this car was on display. If you could see the front windshield rolled down, the front windshield pushed down so the driver could get air because the cars were so loud and claustrophobic inside there. Hugely powerful. This car sits today in the Collier Museum or the Revs Institute in Naples, Florida, not to leave the building again because the paint is peeling off. And Miles Collier figures that it was painted on a humid day back in 1952, and the paint never adhered to the metal enough, so he's not going to let it out of a climate-controlled environment. So this car, the actual car, won't be outside again, but Chuck Schoendorf of Row 8 in Connecticut has built a virtual replica of this car, having digitized the body down at Naples and made it with Miles Collier's authorization. So it's an amazing car. So you can see it at events at Lime Rock, whatever, still today. So let's talk about the C3. The C3 was built starting in 1952. Now, C3 is the street car like the one I showed you in the beginning. It was one of 25 built. They built 20 coupes and 5 convertibles. Number 5207, which is my car, is the second Vignale coupe built. They were constructed in West Palm Beach, Florida. That was a driving chassis. And then those chassis were shipped to Vignale in Italy, where the bodies were made of aluminum. They all had 331 Chrysler Hemi engines. The first 4 cars had a 3-speed Cadillac gearbox. The rest of them had a Chrysler Slush-O-Matic, I call it. The chassis were a racing chassis, a copy of the C2R. And let's get it straight. Briggs never wanted to build street cars. He wanted to go racing. But the Le Mans organizers required that he homologate his cars like Jaguar, like Aston Martin, like Ferrari, he had to build at least 25 streetcars to go racing. He had to be a manufacturer. So he became a reluctant manufacturer. So he went to Giovanni Michelotti to come up with some concepts. This was the initial concept for the C3 Cunningham. And actually the one that was chosen was this one. If you look at my car and look at this, there's very little similarity. The roof on my car is nowhere near as aerodynamic and streamlined as that one, but it is what it is. Michelotti was a designer, and then those plans were given over to Vignali, and they built the cars. So I guess a car this aerodynamic and swoopy just wasn't practical for people to get in and out. So they made one that was a little more cumbersome, but ultimately more practical. So here's the original kind of flyer for the car, and you'll find it's very interesting. If you look here, 1952 Cunningham C3 delivered to the factory. Blah, blah, blah. The sports roadster was $8,000, and the coupe was $9,000. Now just imagine that today. If you go to buy a new Corvette C8, when is the roadster cheaper than the coupe? Never. I mean, it's never happened. But in these days, the figuring was that to make a roadster, all they had to do is sew a convertible top. And sewing a convertible top and building a mechanism was much less time consuming than using an English wheel and hammers and dollies to build an aluminum roof. So the coupe was more expensive. Ultimately, these prices went up over time. In 1953 and 1954, when probably the last cars were sold, I think they wound up being $10,000 for the Roadster and $11,000 for the coupe. Initially, it was the plans of Phil Walters, who was the lead driver for the Cunningham team and also the sales manager for the C3 program. He told Briggs, look, if we build 25, we're homologated for Le Mans, but if we build 50, we can use the profits to offset our racing expenses. Well, what a concept, right? Well, that didn't work out very well, because I was down at the Revs Institute a couple of years ago and saw a study of the time and materials for each car produced. And for, let's say, in the latter years for the C3, they sold for like $11,000 or $12,000 for the coupe. It cost them $14,000 to build with all in. So they lost, at least $2,000 for every car. But if you look down here, you could have options. Actually, they came standard with the 4 carburetors and the Cunningham manifold, but you could get ported heads and high compression pistons and connecting rods or whatever. So this is the initial flyer for the Cunningham C3. I've been a Cunningham fan since my mid-20s. When I first got a job in auto racing, it was with a small public relations firm in Montvale, New Jersey. And I had all the Cunningham toys, all the artwork, all the books, everything you could buy that was Cunningham related, I had. Realizing I could probably never have a Cunningham car because they were so few made, and certainly they were all in large, collections that millionaires owned. But as a person in the PR world, in the racing PR world, I was approached by the Talladega Auto Racing Hall of Fame because every year they had an induction ceremony for Hall of Fame members. And, no surprise, Talladega, Alabama, and in the Southeast United States, most of those inductees were Fireball Roberts and, Richard Petty and Tim Flock and Herb Thomas and stock car people like that. They said, you know what, there's not enough road racing people getting involved there. Do you have a suggestion? And I said, well, yeah, I do. It's Briggs Cunningham. They said, well, if you can get enough support behind that members will vote for him, we'd like to see him in there. So I got in touch with all my media friends, and they were part of this election process. And Briggs Cunningham in 2003 was inducted into the International Motorsport Hall of Fame in Talladega, Alabama. I felt it was important for him to be inducted while he was still alive, even though his stage of dementia was very severe at that point. He was still alive and died just a few months later. But so this was at the induction ceremony. Briggs, of course, was bedridden in California at his home. But to my right is Briggs Cunningham III, Briggs's son. And to my left is John Fitch, who was a longtime Cunningham driver and in some ways team manager for later racing exploits. So this was a great night, all in our tuxedos, where Briggs got inducted into the Hall of Fame. So it was a way for me to become part of the Cunningham family, so to speak, without having to own a Cunningham. So I gave a discussion at the Sports Car Club of America, the SCCA, Carolina region trophy, kind of the awards ceremony in 2007 or 2008. And it was about barn finds. I write books on barn finds. So I talked about barn finds. And when I got back to the table to eat my rubber chicken, John Finger, who was a friend of mine and a longtime race driver, and he was the guy who invited me to this banquet to give a talk. I sat down and he said, "What would be your ultimate barn find?" And I've been asked this many times. And I said, "You know, John, my whole life I dreamed about finding a 289 Cobra and being able to buy it and revive it and drive it. You know what? And I had the good fortune to find not only one or two, but actually three Cobras in various states of disrepair. And so I've kind of already lived that fantasy because I bought one and restored it and enjoyed it. And then I went back to eat my rubber chicken when he said, "What would be your second ultimate barn find?" And that to me was the first time that question had ever been asked. People usually dropped it and went on to another conversation or about the Cobras or whatever. And I put down my fork and I said, "That's an interesting question, John. I have to tell you that I've been a Briggs Cunningham enthusiast since my mid-20s. And I would love to one day own a Cunningham, but I realize that's probably not in the cards because there just were so few made. I mean, you think about a Ferrari GTO is a rare car. They made 39. Well, they only made 36 Cunninghams in total, race cars, street cars, everything. So I said it would be to own a Cunningham. He said, "I know where there's a Cunningham." And I was like, "What?" Like, I'm in Spartanburg, South Carolina. How? He says, "A friend of mine's got it up in Greenville." Now, Greenville is, half hour away from Spartanburg. I'm in the deep South. I'm in NASCAR country. And apparently there's a Cunningham. And then I started to figure quickly in my head, well, it's probably a kit car. It's probably a fiberglass body. It's probably got a Corvair engine or something. He says, "I can take you there next week." Whoa. And so he did take me there next week. And it happened to be in a friend of his garage. Actually, it was in his basement. It had been there for decades. And this is the car coming out into the light. I didn't think it would be real, but when I got there, I realized it was real. And I didn't know what car it was. I didn't know the history of the car. Actually, it took me a couple of years to convince the owner that I was the rightful next caretaker of the car. He wasn't a particular Cunningham enthusiast. He bought it because it was a local car that had been kind of abused, sitting outside a garage for a long time. He was a car enthusiast, not a Cunningham enthusiast, but his father was. So he bought it in kind of in respect or in tribute to his father. He bought the car. And after me becoming friends with him and just kind of greasing the skids, so to speak, a couple of years later, he said, you are so enthusiastic about this car. You need to be the next owner. There was a Lamborghini parked next to his car. Lamborghini, I guess the first generation of rear engine cars had the big sideways V12 in it. Lambo. I forget the model of it. You're probably all thinking of the name. But he said, you've never even, looked one moment at the Lamborghini. When people walk in my garage, that's the car they look at, and there's a Cunningham. He said, you're the guy that owns this Cunningham because that's all you're paying attention to. So I wound up buying the car. I didn't steal it. I paid market value for it. But I had been able to buy one of two Cunninghams that had disappeared off the face of the earth. Nobody knew where they were. But now one of those two was found. So I went down there to pick it up, and I went with my son, who at the time was probably a senior in high school. And I wanted to verify what car this was, because it came with absolutely no paperwork. And so I found out that no Cunninghams of that early vintage, like the first 10, had any serial number in the chassis. But I found out that the engine had a serial number on it, and that you could identify which car it was through the engine. So I'm underneath there. My son's out there with his iPhone, whatever he had back then. And I'm underneath the car. Somebody said that the engine numbers are on the side of the block. So I have the car jacked up. I've got jack stands underneath there. I've got brake clean. I've got rags. I'm on a creeper, and I'm trying to clean the side of the engine to see if there's numbers. When Brian says to me, "Oh, Dad," and he's on Google, "the serial number is right behind the water pump on the front of the block." Okay. So here's my son, who knew nothing about Cunninghams, telling me where the number was. So this is that number, IND 20-1012. So when I got home that night, I looked up in the Cunningham, a very rudimentary register, and it told me that this was the second Cunningham built. Oh, wow, that's interesting. So of the 25 Vignale cars, this was the second one built. And the first two were considered prototypes. So mine was number 5207, and the first Cunningham built, C3 Vignale, was 5206. So IND stands for industrial. So Briggs Cunningham got these motors from Chrysler, from their industrial division. Chrysler Hemis were popularly used in gas-powered generators for emergency use, whatever, sirens for police and fire departments, wherever, water pumps, wherever a powerful industrial application might be needed. Chrysler was one of the companies that sold those. So it's an industrial motor, as it should be.
Hey, Tom,
Yes.
how long did that process take from the time you saw the car until you actually got it there on the trailer?
About 2 years. About 2 years. I had to become friends with the owner. And that, no surprise there. I was a salesman for a long time. And I know when you want to sell something, you have to sell yourself first. Well, in this case, I wanted to buy something. So I had to sell myself first. And so the owner, finally said, "You know what, you deserve this car more than I do, because you're going to do something with it. All I'm doing is having it sit." So I was the first non-South Carolina owner since 1955, when this car first came to Greenville. So if you imagine this, it came to Greenville, South Carolina in 1955 with the first owner in South Carolina, not the first owner, period. It came with the first owner. And I bought it in 2008. So 55, 65, 75, 85, 95, 2005. So 53 years later, I was taking that out of Greenville to become now a resident of Davidson, North Carolina, just a couple hours up the road. You can see that the headlight trim was missing, and there were other people, but thankfully everything was included with the car. It was absolutely 100% complete. However, because it sat outside for many years, even though it's got an aluminum body, rain went inside the window frame and rotted out the inside of the doors. Even though the doors are aluminum skinned, they have steel inside. And so the winding mechanism for the windows and the door latches, so we had to rebuild all that stuff. So what I did was I decided not to restore the car, but refurbish it mechanically and leave it cosmetically the way I found it. So somebody had painted it flat black, primer, way early on. Well, that's the way it stayed. And the interior was kind of in shambles, and that's kind of the way I kept it. because, I kind of like the theory of not every car has to look like it's brand new. It's okay for an old car to look old, just like it's okay for an old person to look old, which is why I'll probably never get plastic surgery. So from the register, here's the register of my car in total. So this is how I found out. 5207 coupe, the engine was 20-1012, and it's at the time they realized it was still in the car. Virtually identical to 5206. Now I want to show you the difference between my car, the first car, and my car, the second car, and every other Cunningham. If you look at the side window, every Cunningham after mine, so in other words 5208 on up, had vent windows on those doors. So there were vent windows. So only 5206 and 5207 have no vent windows. Also, I have no cowl vent. Actually, I found an internal Cunningham document of a letter from Phil Walters to Vignali. Look, in America, we need vent windows and we need cowl vents because these cars are like, you can suffocate inside these cars. So mine's one of the suffocation cars before they straighten that out. But it also makes my car, unique. And I'll get into more of this stuff later, but the upshot down on the bottom here is that the car was displayed at the Hartford Autorama. It was displayed at the Watkins Glen and Elkhart Lake Concours d'Elegance in 1952, held in conjunction with the Grand Prix. It appeared in a numerous number of books and magazines by a guy named John Wheelock Freeman, and was part of the 10 automobiles exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Holy crap. So it turns out this was the media car for Cunningham. If you were a magazine editor back in the day, this is the car you would have used to do road tests, 0 to 60, cornering, drive comfort, whatever. Wow. So suddenly my car was kind of I was picking up a history of the car when in fact, when I bought it, it had 0. So I put it back together slightly. In other words, I put the headlights back in. These are not correct hubcaps. They're actually Lincoln hubcaps. But this is when we were invited down to Palm Beach to display our cars. And while we were down there, there was like maybe, 6 or 8 Cunninghams down there in total. We went to the old Cunningham Factory on Elizabeth Avenue in West Palm Beach. And this is the factory, which at the time was for rent. This is the factory where these cars were built, along with the race cars. And because it was for rent, the owner of that building let us go inside. And so we got to fantasize about, where these cars were built. And I was looking for like a lock washer or a cotter pin jammed in a corner somewhere that might have been part of the Cunningham operation 60 years earlier. This was the day before we went to Mar-a-Lago to display the cars. And next to my car were other Cunninghams. So we lined them up in numerical order as to their serial number. So my car was the first car because it was the second one built, the oldest one there. And there were other cars to the right of my car. Mine was certainly the dingiest one, but also the one that got the most attention. And in fact, it appeared on the front page of the Palm Beach News on Monday morning. Then they invited us out to the racetrack, which at the time was called Moroso Motorsport Park. Now it's called Palm Beach International Speedway. Now understand that I had purchased my car 3 weeks earlier, 4 weeks earlier. It had not been run since, a half a century, I suppose. The brakes, I could only get brakes in 3 of the wheels. So I used a vice grip to crimp off the brake line going to one of the rear wheels. So I had brakes on 3 wheels. And they invited us out to the racetrack to display our cars during a Ferrari event that was there. And they said, would you take some laps? I said, I've driven this car 15 feet. Are you kidding me? The tires were brand new, 50-year-old tires that had cracks in the side that were so wide you could put quarters in there. But 2 of us decided to venture out onto the racetrack, this convertible, and my coupe, and I took 3 laps. And there's a friend of mine inside the car with me, Brian Barr, and he had a video camera going. And these tires were so flat spotted, it was like I was driving on 4x4s. Bang, 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 bang. That was the first lap, and I probably hit 20 miles an hour. The second lap, they smoothed out a little bit, and they got smoother and rounder, and I probably hit 50. And on the third lap, I said to Brian, hold on, I'm going for it. And I hit 80 miles an hour. The guy in the convertible next to me said, you are crazy. I don't want to be anywhere near you. That car could fall apart. The tires could go flat. The brakes could fail. Anyway, I wanted to beating him. That's just the competitive nature I have. So having driven it on and off a trailer only in 50 years, I was doing 80 miles an hour on a racetrack and somehow kept it all together. And, you know, I started to like have fun with the car because Cunningham's, you know, the last 3 Cunninghams that have sold for 1.1, 1.2, and $1.3 million. And so I decided I'm going to put a bumper sticker on there, which is on there still today, and just piss a lot of people off, you know, like all these, you know, these snooty guys with Cunninghams. I'm going to drive mine up there, and it's got glass packs on it, and upset a lot of people. That's just my style.
Hey, Tom.
Yeah.
What tires were on the car at that time?
Firestone, I think they're called Super Sports. And Humpy Wheeler, who was my old boss at Charlotte Motor Speedway, told me that those were the sports car racing tires of the day. They were period correct. They were a brand new set that came on the car, but they were half a century old. I still have them. They're still mounted to the original rims. So there you go. So here I am at a Cars and Coffee in Charlotte. You know, next to, you know, you go to a Cars and Coffee, there's lots of Mustangs and Dodge Chargers and all that stuff. But suddenly I had a car that people didn't know what it was. They'd never heard of a Cunningham. People thought it was a P1800 Volvo with a Hemi engine in it. So, you know, you look at it now, it's kind of awkward. You open the hood and it's got a Hemi engine with 4 carburetors. Whoa. So I had the engine rebuilt by a guy who used to build engines for NASCAR. And he said, when are you going to send me the new valve covers for it? Because the valve covers had rust on them. I said, I'm not gonna. He said, well, no engine I built is going to have rusty valve covers. I said, oh yeah, it sure is, because I'm leaving this car this way. So it has rusty valve covers, rusty air cleaner element, housings. So I've taken this car to Cars and Coffee. Because I love exposing my cars to people who have never seen a Cunningham. It's so much fun to do. So as I read further down into this register, the car remained unsold until April '53. And the reason it remained unsold for more than a year was because it was the media car and it was always booked for media events. Records indicate its sale later that year to one Cornet, about whom nothing is known. Well, being a vintage racer, I've raced at Watkins Glen for the historic races, which are held in September, and I met a wonderful man named Denver Cornet. He was attracted to the Morris Minor that I raced. I was attracted to an MGTC he raced. He told me that he had a sports car dealership in Louisville, Kentucky, and he was actually an MG dealer, a Morris Minor dealer. He sold all those type of British cars back in the day. And the MGTC he raced that weekend in the vintage races, he actually bought new from his own dealership and raced it back in 1949 at Watkins Glen. Holy mackerel. I said, I wonder if that Cornet could have been Denver Cornet. So I looked up Denver Cornet. I had his phone number and found out that he had deceased. Ah, crap. That's too bad. But I found out that I looked on the internet and there was a guy named Denny Cornet who had to be related to him. And he lived in I think he lived in Lexington, Kentucky. And so I got a hold of Denny Cornet, who was a pediatrician whose undergraduate degree he got at Davidson College, which where I'm sitting now is 2 miles up the road, Davidson College, North Carolina. He had gone there. So we had something to talk about. And I said, here's a question. I know your dad's deceased. but did he ever own a Cunningham? He said, oh yeah, he owned a Cunningham. In fact, I have some paperwork on it. And I said, you have paperwork on it? Yeah. So I just want to let you show you this. This is the original road course at Watkins Glen. This is not the race circuit. This is the road course, which was a 3-mile circuit. And this particular turn is called Cornet's Stone Bridge. Why? Because in 1949, Denver Cornet rolled the TC MG that I saw, decades later, racing in a vintage race. He rolled it there during the Grand Prix. And so fans came out of the sides and, the side of the road and pushed the car back over onto its wheels. And he continued racing. And he, I know he told me about that incident once. He said, Tom, that's when I learned that whenever you flip a car, you should flip it in complete revolutions so it lands on its wheels, because I flipped it only halfway over and it had to be rolled over before I could continue. So they named that turn at that stone bridge Cornet's Corner. As well, here is a marker on Main Street in Watkins Glen where the original Grand Prix ran down the Main Street, dedicated to Denver Cornet. If you walk down that road, there's ones for Briggs Cunningham and Phil Walters and Walt Hanskin and Carroll Shelby and Phil Hill and famous people that raced at Watkins Glen over the course of decades. They have a plaque. But his son Denny sent me a photo of his dad as a young man with the Cunningham that he had just purchased from his friend Briggs Cunningham. I'm sorry, Denver Cornet standing next to the Cunningham that he had bought from Briggs Cunningham, which was his friend. I mean, Briggs and he were buddies because they both raced at Watkins Glen. Although Denver did tell me that on the original street circuit, and he told me this 25 years ago, that on the original street circuit, there was a hump where sports cars became airborne, and his little MGTC was airborne, and Briggs Cunningham's monstrous C4RK became airborne. And he said, Briggs passed me in midair before we touched down again and went roaring off into the downhill section towards Main Street. But this is Denver Cornet, a man I met many years, probably 50 years after this, with my Cunningham. So you can see another identifying mark on this car that identifies it as mine, as opposed to the first car. It had no vent window, as I said earlier. But if you look at the little parking light lens below the headlight, the first car had that lens offset to the center of the car. It was at an angle to the headlight. Mine was the first car to have that parking light directly down below the headlight. So that's how you can tell the first Cunningham from the second Cunningham, because otherwise they're virtually identical. So his son Denny sent me all this correspondence that his father had from purchasing this car. You can see April 19th, 1954. And this was, as I look through the paperwork, from Phil Stiles, who was a racer, but also the general manager, assistant of the general manager of Cunningham Company. Denver put down $2,500 and financed $2,500. He paid $5,000 total for the car. He was a dealer, so I guess his plan was to flip this car as soon as he could and pay back his loan. So this paperwork, this one and the following ones, came in an envelope with a 3-cent stamp on it. So I got original copies of the agreement of the lien, the loan application, the liens, Briggs Cunningham's signature. It's just like, oh, I love this stuff. So I was at a couple of months later, I was at New York City. In 2012, I was president of a group called Port Imperial Racing Association. And our intention was to bring Formula One racing to the shores of the Hudson River on the New Jersey side, not a Formula One race in New York, but in New Jersey. So I lived in Manhattan, and it was easy for me to travel to the Madison Avenue and Sports Car Driving and Chowder Society luncheons once a month. This is the oldest sports car group in New York, or one of the oldest, and they've met at Sardi's since the late 50s. And so I went there and I was a guest speaker or whatever. And as I sat down at my lunch table with all these, 100 other car enthusiasts, Philippe DeFecaro showed me his new book. He said, "This is a book I just wrote about Watkins Glen, the street years, 1948, 1952." And so I said, "That's pretty cool. I mean, can I look at it?" Sure. As I flipped through it, about in the middle of the book, there's a picture. Wow, a Cunningham. No vent window, and the parking light is directly below the headlight. That's my car. Holy crap. Look at it, brand new. So it turns out that Philippe got photographs from a photographer, and that photographer's son, the photographer is now deceased, gave me these photographs. So this is my car, brand new. It was 3-tone. It was dark green in the belt, below the belt molding, a slightly lighter green on the top of the fenders, and then cream. So lots of Cunninghams came in 2-tone, some came in 3-tone. This is my car, brand new. It was entered in the 1952 Watkins Glen Concours d'Elegance that was held in conjunction with the Grand Prix that year. And this is in the fairgrounds area, which now is an industrial park. And there's an MGTD in the background. Well, I own an MGTD, and I thought about reenacting this photograph with my wife. She could put on a kerchief and a raincoat, and I could put a number 113 in the front and reenact the same type photograph to these days. But I haven't done that yet. So Harold Lance, who took that photograph back in the day, his son sent me these photographs. This was a big deal. This was America's first sports car since World War II, and enthusiasts were nuts about it. So he sent me photographs of the car, several different poses. So this is the car, from the back. Quite a beautiful, paint scheme. He sent me a photo of the interior, which now the car's in shambles, but back then, look at that. It's beautiful, and the gauges are fantastic. Huge gauges, very reminiscent of Ferrari gauges back in the day. Although Cunningham wisely decided to send Stuart Warner and Ford gauges to Italy to have the gauges made out of those, because it would be much easier to find replacement and get them serviced in the States, as opposed to if they used some kind of exotic Italian gauge. So it cost me $5,000 to have these gauges rebuilt, but they're beautiful. Wooden steering wheel, still on the car. Lots of hand etching on the wheel and the trim around it, all still with the car. Someday, if I restore it, it will look like this again. At the same concourse, which is probably held on the Saturday before the Sunday race, here's Briggs at that concourse with a sandwich and a Coke in his hand, or I guess a hot dog and a Coke in his hand. That's Briggs Cunningham in the middle. Interestingly, the car to his right, you can see the wheel there, is his 1910 American Underslung. Briggs Cunningham was not only a contemporary racer at the day, but he was a car collector. This 1910 car was only one of many cars he had in a collection. He was one of the early collectors of cars. And so he displayed this car in another class, in the historic class. So my car and that car were displayed on the same field in 1952. 3 years ago, I discovered that car, that American Underslung that was owned by Briggs Cunningham, was on display, and it actually is owned by the Seal Cove Auto Museum in Seal Cove, Maine, on Mount Desert Island. And I was able to park my car next to that car again for the first time in 60 years, I guess. And actually, my wife and I adopted this car. We send a certain amount of money each year to the museum, and that car is like, we pay to have that car cleaned, I guess, dusted off, whatever. We adopted the car, the American Underslung. So that's the car that we adopted 3 years ago. Just amazing coincidence. Well, I have a friend named
Tom,
I used to race with in the Northeast named Billy Giltzow. And Billy raced a Turner back when I raced a Datsun 510 at places like Bridgehampton, Lime Rock. Well, I just want to show you, before I talk about Billy, Here's the newspaper story that appeared in the Elmira Star Gazette way down the bottom here. The trade group, the trade class for the concourse, the 1952 Cunningham of West Palm Beach, Florida, won first place. Wow, imagine that. So Mike Cunningham won first place in that. Here are other pictures of the car driving around town that weekend at Watkins Glen. These were taken from the Cunningham family photo collection. So here's my car driving around a wet street. No surprise, you know, in October in Watkins Glen, it always rained. More pictures of it driving onto the fairgrounds into the concourse parking lot where it was displayed. But my friend Billy Gilsow's father took pictures of the car also at that Concours d'Elegance 52. And so I got a different view of the car from another photographer that was shooting with color film that year. So Howard Lance and William Gilsow, Billy's father, both were shooting in color film in 1952, which is relatively new back then. So these are photos and files that could have been thrown out, you know, decades ago. You know, they're deceased. What's this old stuff? Let's just throw it out. And this stuff was coming out to me still, which I found amazing. So my car, having been purchased with zero documentation, it seems like almost daily I was adding to its heritage. Here's another picture from William Gilsow, and you can see all the attention this car was getting at Watkins Glen, in the fairgrounds for that concourse. So it was also displayed at the Elkhart Lake concourse that same year. And you can see first place, Cunningham, Type C3, hardtop coupe, 1952. Briggs Cunningham was the entrant from Palm Beach, Florida. Wow. So I go to Elkhart Lake on a business trip. I was there anyway. And the track didn't have any history of the car. And I wound up going to the newspaper. They didn't have any history of the car. They got rid of all their old files. But I went to the Sheboygan Falls Historical Society, who had file cabinets filled with old racing stuff and concourse stuff, whatever. And I had a little while until I had to catch my ferry boat back to Michigan. And just as I was about to throw up my arms, I can't find anything, I found this photograph in their files. This was the car on display at Elkhart Lake in 52, where it won first place in its class also. So I have a picture of it at the Watkins Glen concourse. I have a picture of it now of the Elkhart Lake concourse. And if you're bored, I apologize, but I get turned on by this stuff. So,
Hey, Tom, a question.
yes.
Since the car sat so long, what did you do? This goes back to when you got the car. What did you do to fire up the engine? Because I think I remember it was a couple of weeks later that you were out there like a crazy man driving in bad tires. So what did you do to
basically poured Marvel Mystery Oil in it, and that's about it. It fired up and ran. It was a while later that I had it rebuilt, but really nothing. I mean, leave it to good old American technology and old gas, not this modern gas we have, but old gas didn't turn to jelly in the carburetors. It fired up, it ran. So, and it went 80 miles an hour. And I'll tell more about that later.
Okay.
So the continuous history of the car continues with this guy, T.L. Wilson of Tennessee, and Grady Miller. And how do I find out this stuff? Well, the internet's an amazing device. And I was to find out that Grady Miller was the first owner of my car in Greenville, South Carolina. He bought it when he was on his honeymoon in Clearwater, Florida. And this was him. Sadly, I met him before he passed. He had dementia. This was him in a nursing home. Grady Miller had more recently owned motorcycle dealerships in the Greenville, South Carolina area. Prior to that, his family owned a Pontiac dealership in Seneca, South Carolina. Well, I went and met him with his son and John Finger, who turned me on to the car originally. Grady Miller bought this on his honeymoon, but didn't remember anything about it. I showed him pictures. He said, "That's a nice looking car," but I don't know anything about it. So it was sad that his mind has already been affected like that. But this was the site in Seneca, South Carolina, of the Pontiac dealership that he grew up around, his family owned. So he got married and went down to Clearwater, Florida for his honeymoon and wound up trading in his 1955 Pontiac, so this was in June 56. So the car was already a year old. He gave $600 in cash, traded in his Pontiac for a total price of $2,570 and drove home the Cunningham. So now he brought it from Florida to South Carolina, where it was to remain 4 different owners until I bought it. So this is some of the paperwork that I wound up getting later on. This was a note from his father that he was allowed to drive this car. I think he was maybe underage, I'm not sure, but he was in the service and you had to have permission to have a car on base. And so this was giving his son permission to drive that car on the base, which I think was in Baltimore or something. He used it as a daily driver up there. I also got the original, a title with the car that he got. So he never registered the car, nor did anybody else after him in Greenville register the car. But it gave me a new name, Fivolent Lowell, or as I was to find out, it was Lowell Fivolent in St. Petersburg, Florida, owned the car. And I think he bought it from Denver Cornet, if you remember, the sports car dealer in Kentucky. So I still have this title in my files. It was never signed after Lowell Fivolent. Well, Lowell Fivolent, I went to Google and searched and found a name and whatever. This was him as a young guy. And he wound up becoming involved in real estate. This was him as a little bit older with his young son as a fisherman. Lowell was a sports car enthusiast. He had owned a couple of sports cars, including my Cunningham in the mid 50s. And actually he would have bought it in probably 55, and then sold it to Grady Miller in 56. He was a professional, let me think, bass player with an orchestra as his secondary job to real estate. And this is the house that he lived in during that time where my Cunningham would have been parked in that carport back in the 50s. And this is the corner in Clearwater where the gas station was, where my car was parked out in front for sale, that when Grady Miller came down from his honeymoon night downstairs, I got to own that car, and traded his Pontiac and drove the Cunningham home. So little by little, I'm putting this together. It's like cutting into a tree and making a history out of all the circles in the tree to tell the history of it. I came across this picture. This is Briggs standing in front of my car at his Greens Farms, Connecticut estate. That he used this car as his own set of wheels for a period of time. And so this is it. And here you can see the color scheme is more pronounced, a lighter green, a dark green, and the cream. Ironically, you can see that better in black and white than you could in color. My car was also part of the MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, 10 automobiles display in 1952. It was a display of cars and a brochure that the museum curators felt were the most beautiful cars of that time, which included cars like Studebaker, Seata, cars like that. Well, the Cunningham made the list, and so there it is in its book, in the book that accompanied the. And I got this copies of this book on eBay. It appeared in Esquire magazine, and here it is featured in Esquire magazine. Cunningham, like Nash Healy, the body made by Italian specialist Vignali, blah blah blah. This one costs about $10,000. So you can see the price had jumped up from $9,000 to $10,000 for the coupe by this time, a year later. It appeared in Cars magazine, which was a satellite publication of Mechanics Illustrated, and here it is on the front cover, the guy standing next to it. It appeared in True's Automobile Yearbook. It was a story about Briggs Cunningham, his various cars over the years, his racing endeavors, and there's my Cunningham. Again, no vent window, and the the parking lights were directly below the headlights. Now, this is interesting. I found out John Wheelock Freeman. I was searching for him for a couple of years. And he and his photographer, Alexander Georges, wrote a number of books back in the day. They were young guys. They were like 21 years old. And they went to Europe for a year and went to all the car factories, photographing and documenting cars, and wrote a series of books. Well, I bought a number of these books on eBay. And my car was featured in there. There it is, featured in that book. This was when it was still lived in on the northeast under Cunningham ownership. But I found out, I wanted to see if he was still alive, and I found out that for 50 years he was the editor for the New York Ballet Review. What? Ballet? So I called up the New York Ballet Review, which is still in business, and I said, "Is he still alive?" He says, "Oh yeah, I'll give you his email." I said, "Holy mackerel, John Wheelock Freeman still alive?" So I wound up getting him on the phone, and I went up to the Bronx where he lived. And the night before, I was driving my Porsche up there, and I said, "The Bronx, ooh, is it safe for me to park my car in the Bronx while I meet you?" He said, "Oh yeah, it's very safe." Well, he lived on the Hudson River in an estate that was several acres large. No problem parking my Porsche there. So I had him sign this book, All the Best, Tom Cotter, John W. Freeman, 8/3/13. He said, "Tom, I have to tell you that nobody has, ever asked me to sign one of my pieces, and B, never mind a half a century after I wrote it." So I've got this in my files, which is kind of cool. He wrote another book here, Sports Cars. You can see John Wheelock Freeman, photography by Alexander Georges. And there's the car again, same photographs, I suppose. They wrote lots of books. The Rebs Institute down in Naples, Miles Collier Place, had a number of photographs of the car. And here's one with my car of the engine. You can see the 4 carburetors there mounted on the Hemi engine. The interior, a different view. You can see there, the way the seats should have looked instead of the ripped up condition they are now. Again, the same license plate, 6D750. I'd like to get a Florida plate made like that to put on my car, but the only company I can find that does license plate reproductions is not allowed to do Florida plates. So I don't know, I'll figure something out. So here's the car in the Alfred Momo shops in Woodside, Queens, New York. You can see it brand new there again. Now here it is on display at the Southampton Auto Museum, which was owned by Henry Austin Clark, one of the very early car collectors. Actually started to collect cars before World War II. And you can see somewhat the shape of the building behind this lady, there's a piece coming out of her head. Well, that's actually the curved Quonset hut building style that his museum was based in. And I take it that this was an art show. A glamour show, a fashion show for charity of some sort. And here are women that were just, going to be on the runway, so to speak. And here's the car at the same event being driven by Phil Walters. So it was probably a fashion show and a car show all in one. And these were taken by I. Cantor of Southampton, New York in '52. Phil Walters, again, was the sales manager and the business manager for the Cunningham operation down in West Palm Beach, Florida, and also the lead driver. He was also a Long Island native, and his alternate name was Ted Tappet. And Ted Tappet was a midget car racer at Freeport Raceway in the 50s. He changed his name to Ted Tappet so his parents would not find out that he was racing. I have to tell you that one of the early heroes, or he was an early hero of Dan Gurney. Dan Gurney, who grew up in Port Jefferson, Long Island, used to hitchhike out to Freeport Raceway as a kid. And there's a great photograph of him holding a banner, a bed sheet up in the grandstand, and said Ted Tappet. And, Dan Gurney told me he was my hero, man. Well, he went on to greater things than midget racing. As Phil Walters, his real name, he became one of the most renowned sports car drivers of the era. Another owner of the car was T.L. Wilson. And I got this photograph of T.L. Wilson on the left and Jim Watson on the right. T.L. Wilson, is an interesting guy. Went to seminary and was a Presbyterian minister in Greenville, South Carolina. He kind of looks half asleep here. He became a minister in the Presbyterian Church, owned my Cunningham. I don't think he ever drove it, owned it for a couple of years. And also owned a 4-cam Porsche Speedster, a 4-cam Carrera, maybe a 550 Spider. He was came from a very wealthy family, had no need to take a salary from the church, but his family money allowed him to have these amazing cars. Here he is leaning against a 356C that he owned, and his friend Jim Watts next to him gave me these photographs. Jim was a Porsche racer and restorer and serviceman back in the day. I couldn't find out any more about T.L. Wilson until a little while later. This is when he owned the car back in the day, and this is taking a road race in Alabama. You can see the car had changed now from 3-tone green, green, cream to 2-tone black and red. And this was an airport race back in the probably the early 60s when he owned this car. It had changed hubcaps by this time as well. These were kind of a hot rod or a custom car hubcap available through Almquist and other hot rod custom car parts dealers, I've found out. This man, George Guy, wound up owning the car because T.L. Wilson, the Presbyterian minister, brought it to his shop to have serviced and didn't pay the bill for whatever reason. I don't know. But George Guy was an interesting guy. He was a hydroplane racer, a NASA aerospace engineer, and ultimately opened a shop in his hometown of Greenville, South Carolina, that serviced exotic cars, and I guess the Cunningham counted as that. But when it didn't get paid, he took possession of the car, owned it for a number of years. He got it under a mechanic's lien. So this is George Guy, who's now deceased, of Greenville, and he was a motorboat racer and a car racer, and I guess people tell me a brilliant guy. Here's a poster of him speedboat racing on the Saluda River. George Guy, former world champion hydroplane racer. Interestingly, this is crazy, crazy, crazy. T.L. Wilson was a Presbyterian minister. When George Guy got older, he became a minister of men as well, a man of the cloth, which is just like crazy, crazy. But my car was owned by 2 former men of the cloth. And here's George Guy, you can see in his new outfit. I bought the car ultimately from the guy that bought it from George Guy. This is Sam Harrison. Sam owns an antique mall in Greenville, South Carolina. And he's the guy that said to me, you need to own this car more than I do because it means more to you than it means to me. So great guy. He's a great friend. And when I got this car mechanically sound, drove it 2.5 hours south to Greenville just to show him I got it running, gave him a ride around the block, and drove it home again. Now, here's another crazy part of the story. Here's my car on the left and another Cunningham on the right. These cars have something in common. You can see the one on the right is a newer car. It's got vent windows. So you see the vent windows in the front windows. Mine doesn't have them. Okay, here's the connection between these 2 cars. Mine was owned by T.L. Wilson. When he lost that car in a mechanic's lien to George Guy, he bought a second Cunningham, and that's the one on the right. Now, these cars had never met each other, even though they were, owned by the same Presbyterian minister at one time, at 2 different times. They never met each other. Well, here they are in my driveway meeting each other in Davidson, North Carolina for the first time ever, because they were built, a year apart. And so they would have never met anywhere in their life, except in my driveway in about, 2013 or so. T.L. Wilson owned that car. When he died, he left it to his friend, Jim Watson, who I showed you on the right side of that photograph. Jim Watson owned it for a number of years. He called me up and said, Tom, I'm not a Cunningham guy. I'm a Porsche guy. Can you help me sell it? So I did. I said, send it to me and I'll sell it for you. I'm sure I can sell it for you. And so he sent it to me. I'm jumping ahead. and it ultimately became this car. If this looks familiar, it's because Jay Leno was the purchaser of that car. He had always been intrigued with Cunninghams. This was the white car in my driveway, now painted back to its original dark gray, maroon, lighter gray configuration. This is in Leno's shop. This is just prior to its completion of the restoration, but you can see that, you know, it's back to the original colors, but he modified it somewhat. It's got a 5-speed. It's got disc brakes in the front. It's got aluminum heads on it, which lessens the weight on the front end. But so the car in Leno's collection and the car in mine were related by a common parentage back in the day. So here's a neat picture of Briggs Cunningham. This is when he got married in 1928. And I happened to ask his daughter, I said, man, your parents had amazing fur coats. She said, well, that was my father's coat when he went to Yale in 1926. The fur coat, when you went to Yale and you wanted to watch football games, you better have a coat like this in Connecticut in the wintertime, because it was damn cold. And so, like, wow. So she said, I have that coat in my closet still. I said, are you kidding me? You've got your father's coat from Yale? Yes. So she showed it to me, and like I freaked out. I put it on, hoping to get a little DNA out of the pockets or something, or at least like $1,000 bill or something. But no, but it did say in there, made expressly for Briggs S. Cunningham. So there you go. My car was used as a model. Do you have a question, Bill? I saw you.
Yeah, I had a question here that comment about if you at some point would make some comments about the I guess the trip that you took on Route 30 in something special. I mean, that may not fit in right now because I walked out of the room, but
I'll tell you what, I will say a lot about that if you'll have me back, and I'll do a whole presentation about driving a Model T Ford on the Lincoln Highway from New York City to San Francisco.
we will pursue that.
All right, cool. But I don't want to get off track because we're going to lose people. So
yeah, there was on the question. Did you model that or take a picture wearing that fur coat?
I'll get to that.
Okay.
Okay, so here's my Cunningham. One of the Cunninghams that had been long kind of disassembled and kind of ignored and forgotten was the car that the Peterson Museum had. Dick Metzler found it in a desert in Arizona, bought it for the museum, and it had changed hands a few times. Anyway, RM Restorations, which is part of RM Auctions in Ontario, Canada, was hired to restore that car, but it was missing so many parts. So they asked if they could borrow my car to restore it. Now, the thing is, my car is 5207. They were consigned to restore 5208, which is one serial number later. And even though it had vent windows, everything else was the same. So here it is up in Canada at the RM restoration shops. They do some of the finest restoration work in North America. And so they needed my car to make things like bumpers and grills and trim. And so this is it on display in Ontario. They picked it up and dropped it off. And that was kind of a cool piece of the history of my car, modern history. On eBay, I found a photograph. Somebody was selling a video. They said vintage, Cunningham video. And that's my car at Watkins Glen with a woman standing in front of it. Wow. So I wound up buying that video. I have it still today. It's about a 12-minute long video. Home movies of the Cunningham Factory and of my car at Watkins Glen. If you remember, my car was part of the Hartford, Connecticut Autorama. Well, here it is winning a first place award for that. This is Hartford, Connecticut Autorama, 1952. I think it was held in the winter time, just before Christmas. So here it is again, black and white photo. You can see more pronounced three-tone. Here it is that Speed Age magazine used my car for road tests. And so here it is being picked up in Connecticut and used for road tests by Speed Age magazine. You can see their official Oldsmobile car in front of it on display. So I'm adding more and more and more to the car's lineage constantly. Okay, here's the Leno cars again. You see that. I raced my car a few times. This is it at the Hershey Hill Climb, not far, Bill, from probably less than a mile from where you're sitting right now.
Not much more than
It's
that.
the Hershey Hill Climb coming up the back of the hotel. It's a historic hill climb. And I said, what the hell? I'm in the concourse on Sunday. I'm going to run it on the hill climb Saturday. And I'm not afraid to get in this car out of control. It's got a lot of power and torque. So I can usually steer it with the rear wheels. And here it is. I'm getting slightly sideways, coming up the back side. So this was probably in 2016, 2017, something like that. Here I am at the Mount Equinox Hill Climb in Vermont. Briggs ran this course several times with his race cars. I'm not aware of a C3 ever running up here, but this is it running up, at speed, up a couple of mile course at Manchester, Vermont, at Mount Equinox. So I've taken this car to concours, to rat rod shows, to cruise-ins, to tours, to hill climbs, and then to Lime Rock in 2018. I raced it at the VSCCA race held over Labor Day weekend in 2018 as part of the vintage races. So I got to tell you, I drove this car around Lime Rock. It's got a 3-speed transmission. I kept it in third gear all the way around, and I was like I was sitting on a lounge chair or a couch driving around, and it's so big, and I never had to shift it downshift or upshift around turns or up hills. I just kept it in third gear and raced it all around the course, and it was pretty cool. When I got back in my Corvette later that day, it felt like I was driving a Miata. It was so nice and small and tight. My huge Corvette felt like a Mazda Miata.
Just to follow, Tom, can you say a few words about the design of the chassis, the suspension? Because it seems pretty well controlled, except when you have it sideways in Hershey.
Well, yeah, it was built. The chassis was a C2R racing chassis. C2 means Cunningham. 2 was second generation, and R meant racing. So this didn't have the Dion rear end like the C4Rs did, but it had a solid rear axle like the C2R race car, the previous generation, or the prior generation. It has a Chrysler rear end. The cars were a combination of Mercury suspension and Chrysler suspension. Mine, though, is all Chrysler suspension. It has a four bar rear suspension, independent front suspension with upper and lower control arms. Pretty straightforward, but monumental for the day, like earth-shattering for the day. Drum brakes all around. A very small sway bar in the front, like almost as big as your pinky. If it had a hefty sway bar of the car, I'm sure it could have done much better. It's pretty much a huge car. It weighs a lot. It was supposed to be 2,800 pounds on paper. It wound up being 3,200 pounds. But if you imagine this huge car, heavy car, for 2 people, is like a 2-passenger car. It's almost like, wow. An MGTD was a 2-passenger car, and so was a Cunningham. It's kind of like, wow. Couldn't you made it a little bit lighter? But they did the best they could. The engine with the built-in bell housing, cast iron, weighed 750 pounds by itself. So if you think about an H modified race car, they weighed 750 pounds, with this little tiny Crosley motor, all by themselves. The whole car weighed 750. Just the engine in this car weighed 750. So they had to build a huge car around it to accommodate that huge power plant. I had a fun time. My car had never been raced, but I wanted to pay tribute to drivers who had driven Cunninghams in the day. Briggs Cunningham, Phil Walters, John Fitch, and myself. As far as I know, it's the only active Cunningham racer, racing car in the world. You can see the interior. Here's a better shot. The dashboard, the paint's all peeled off. The door panel, it had been painted gray over the original saddle color interior when it went from being a green car to being a red car, a red and black car. They painted it gray over the leather, so it's all falling apart. Stuffing's coming out, but I kind of dig it. It's real. And as my friends in Europe say, Americans ruin old things. They'll get an old chest of drawers and they'll sand it, and then polyurethane it, and they'll take something old and make it new. He said, in Europe, we like old things. So I kind of like apply to that same theory. When I was up at Lime Rock, Paul Chenard did a wonderful pencil sketch of it while it was sitting in the paddock. So I always like this, that he got the rust on the trim. He got the the gray primer. So I always liked this photograph he did. So in 2018 or 19, maybe it was 19, we did the largest Cunningham display in history at the Greenwich Concourse. That's the Long Island Sound behind the cars. And because that's the first Cunningham, this 5206, that's the first Cunningham C3 built. Mine is 5207. And we had every Cunningham C3 ever built beyond my car, all 25 cars, plus every race car but one or two. So of the 36 Cunninghams built and the 35 that remain on Earth, 33 were here on display in chronological order of their manufacture. So this is the streetcar display. You can see the one next to mine has no vent window, but its parking light is off to an angle underneath the headlight. So if that makes sense to you, if you remember that. Across from us, not in this photograph, are some of the early race cars, and beyond us are some of the later race cars. And that's me in the fur coat that Briggs Cunningham's daughter, Lucy, sent for me on Christmas before she passed away. There's a 15-pound box in my front door before Christmas. I opened up, it's a fur coat, and I put it on, and like, I honor that coat. I love it, and it's 10 feet from where I'm sitting right now. If this display were done in real life as opposed to virtually, this is where I would put on that fur coat and walk on the stage, and allow people to put on that fur coat as well. It's pretty darn cool. Anyway, this Cunningham display had every Cunningham on Earth except two. People brought their cars from around the United States. Isn't it amazing that of the 25 Cunninghams built by Vignali in 52/53/54, all 25 still exist. My car had disappeared for decades. It was found. Another car, which was the fourth car built, it's two beyond me in this picture, 5209, was also found sitting in a backyard in Connecticut. Just amazing that none of those cars were lost in collisions, lost to history, scrapped, whatever. It showed that what a special car this was back in the day. And even when the cars became kind of, outdated, historically, they were still special cars.
Common question about what tire do you use today?
I have Diamondback. They're actually, believe it or not, Yokohama's Diamondback tires in South Carolina. Buffs all the markings off the side. So it doesn't say Yokohama or anything like that. It's just smooth. It's buffed smooth. They can also put red line tires and white striped tires and wide white walls. They actually bond it, vulcanize it onto the tire itself. So this is the end of my display. But I want to continue verbally for a moment. I have continued to have fun with this car. It has, it has been displayed at the, actually this should go on more. Okay, there it is. It's not the end. This is when the car was on display at the Corvette Hall of Fame in Kentucky, next to Briggs Cunningham's number 3 Corvette that entered the 1960 Le Mans race, the first time Corvette had ever raced there. Briggs Cunningham brought 3 Corvettes to Le Mans in 1960. The number 1 car crashed within 3 hours. The number 2 car blew its motor at a 20-hour mark. But this car, despite all its problems, finished Le Mans in 8th place and won the GT class. I'm actually writing a book right now about that 3-car effort that Briggs Cunningham um, had at Le Mans in 1960. So when Briggs Cunningham was inducted into the Corvette Hall of Fame 2 years ago, they asked if they could borrow my Cunningham. So it's displayed next to the car that now is owned by Lance Miller, who anybody around the Hershey area probably knows, as he runs the Carlisle Events group. Wonder why this is acting. I might have to do this manually. Something's happened to my controls here. So I wanted to show you one more picture of my car I recently got at Sebring in the paddock in 1955. I recently got it it was on Facebook. How can this be? I got another photo of my car, solid red, not red and black, but solid red, taken in 1955 at Sebring in the paddock. But I'm going to tell you, this summer is going to be the summer I'm going to have so much fun with this car, because I'm picking it up in a month from the AACA museum where it's displayed right now, bringing it to New England where I live in the summer. I have a place in Maine, and I'm going to enter this car in the Thompson Road Races, VSCCA Road Races in June. I'm going to enter it in the Mount Equinox Hill Climb again. I'm going to bring it to Winterport, Maine for the drag races. It's never been drag raced. Well, it will this year. And I'm going to bring it to Loring Air Force Base, the former Air Force Base in Loring, Maine, and run the speed trials there. They open up their several-mile-long runway for Bonneville races before they tow out to the West Coast, out to Utah to test their cars. I'm going to run this car at Loring, see how fast it goes. I'll be happy if it goes 100, but without a roll cage, I have to keep it under 135, which I'm sure, it's not a racing engine. It's just a stock engine. So there you go. So I'm going to have a lot of fun with this car. I guess the internet is telling me this is the end of the presentation because I can't advance it any further. So I'm open for questions. It's been a fun, almost an hour and a half. I hope I haven't bored you to tears, but I'm so excited about this car, and I'm happy to share it with you. So bring on the questions.
I'll ask one that we've got here. If you would comment about the car was displayed at the McCacken, I guess it is Muscle Car and Corvette Nationals. Any comments that you have on that show?
Yeah, I displayed it up there at, I'm an author, I write books, so I displayed it at the Motor Books International booth at the Corvette, Muscle Car and Corvette Nationals in Chicago. And it was pretty cool. People came in the door, and right there was the Motor Books booth, and I was signing books with, co-authors, Marty Shore and Colin Comer and Randy Leffingwell and other people that, wrote books for them. And behind us was my Cunningham. And people coming down, that's where several people said, is that a Volvo? Because if you squint your eyes and you shrunk it down in your mind, it could look like a Volvo 1800. But they looked in there, saw a Hemi, and so all day I was had a trail of people asking about this car, which a gearhead, a Mopar kind of guy, a muscle car, Hemi kind of enthusiast would be thrilled to tears to see that car. So that's one of the events. What else you got, Bill?
I don't have any from the boardroom. Let's see. There was a question about McCacken, about drag racing. Let's see. What was the most common what was the most common color combination for the Cunningham? I guess that was specific to your C3.
Well, yeah, the C3s, there was no common color combination. Every one was different. You just imagine in the 50s, Art Deco, Italian, if you think about Turin, Italy, Torino or Turin is kind of an art capital. So everyone came out differently. So my car was chosen green, green, cream. Other ones were, black and cream. There was at least one black car and at least one white car, solid color, which is unusual. But it was the 50s and colors were kind of wild. And So there were no two cars the same.
How many miles were on it when you bought it?
39,000. It now has about 41,000.
Any other questions? I'm sitting here looking at, I think if I missed your question.
Yeah, I have one question. This is Richard Sills. What, given the fact that this was always such a special car owned by people who cared about it, what was the circumstance that led it to be sitting outside and kind of deteriorating for a number of years? I mean, how did that come about, given the fact that the owners all seemed to realize what a special car it was?
You know, I think that was true. However, if you look at the price, you know, they went from $9,000, and then the first owner bought it for $5,000 from Briggs because it was a used car at that point. And then it went to, I don't know what Lowell Fivelin paid. I'm still trying to put that connection together. I'm searching through Road and Track magazines, whatever, to find a classified ad that might apply. But then Grady Miller bought it for $2,600. I don't know what T.L. Wilson paid for it, but it got cheaper and cheaper and cheaper as time went on, but it was still a special car. But I think the point where it sat outside was when T.L. Wilson, the Presbyterian minister, didn't pay his repair bill to George Guy, and George Guy only had a 2-car repair shop behind his house. He didn't have room to store it inside, and suddenly he became the reluctant owner of it. It was just pushed outside. So I don't know how long it sat there, several years at least. I can't explain that. I also don't know when it went from being red and black, which I have remnants on the inside of the door sills, the red and black paint. I don't know when it went from that to being flat black, but I think it was also during the George Guy era, which would have been the mid 60s probably.
And when did it become the hot rod gray?
I don't know. I don't know when that happened.
Okay.
But it was during its Greenville residency. So sometime between 55 and 2008. But I think I'm guessing it was probably the mid to late 60s.
Well, if there aren't any more questions,
I'd like to make a comment. This is
Okay.
Don Allen from Winter Haven, Florida.
Hi, Don.
And I don't believe you mentioned anything about the Cunninghams racing at Sebring.
Well,
And I was there.
You were there?
Yes.
Well, they won first overall.
And they were just something else, because all the cars at that time were MGs and Triumphs and Porsches that at that point were not much more than VWs. And this Cunningham was so big and so loud. It was amazing.
Man, you know, I love you for being on here and saying that, because I talk about this car. I don't really talk about racing, but Briggs Cunningham / his team won the most prestigious races of the day in the United States. They won Sebring, they won Watkins Glen, they won Elkhart Lake, along with numerous other races. He never did win Le Mans, sadly. His hope was to win Le Mans, but he had a few things against him. And that is that the weight of the engine was so heavy that he had to build a heavy car around that engine. There was no small block Chevy at the time. So I say to people, if there had been a small block Chevy or there had been disc brakes, he would have won Le Mans. But he was just a little bit too early by a couple of years. And he was forced to have the best V8 at the time, which was this Hemi, build a huge car around it. And he was stuck with drum brakes. And, you know, all the efforts he had at Le Mans with trying special linings on the brakes, finned or ventilated brake drums, and, you know, everything else. At the end of the Mulsanne Straight, they often lost their brakes and went into the sandbank, and it took hours to dig it out. So Briggs got 5 top 10 finishes at Le Mans. I'm sorry, 6 top 10 finishes at Le Mans over the 6 years he ran, including 2 thirds, a 4th, and a 5th, but he never won. But Don, thank you so much because, I couldn't have been there because I wasn't, I wasn't old enough to be there, but thank God you were there and remember it.
I was a teenager at the time, probably about 15 or 16. I went to Sebring every year for many, 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 many years.
Do you have any photographs of a Cunningham back then?
I'm not sure. I
Well,
might.
if you do, get in touch with me.
How do I get in touch with you? Through the museum?
You know what? I'm one of these crazy guys. I'll give you my phone number.
Okay.
And everybody listening can call me. I don't care.
Okay.
And anybody on this call that has stumbles across any Cunningham information, I devour this stuff.
Well, I will look. I've got a lot of car pictures. I've got a lot of binders with car pictures, thousands and thousands of them. And I will go back to that era because they're all in date order. And so I'll go back to those years and see what I have.
Thank you.
And I'll get in touch with you if I can come up with anything.
Perfect. Thank you. Anybody else?
Just Bill, there was a question came up, could we do a meet and greet when you pick the car up? This is Bill Sangre. I'll pursue that. If Tom has, I'll try to work that out with Tom. The other thing, there's a question about, from Phil. Let's see. I heard Dunlop wouldn't give, I gotta read this, wouldn't give Cunningham the disc brakes after Jaguar told him, Dunlop, not to give them to. Do you have some comments about that aspect, about potentially why did Cunningham try to get disc brakes for the car and not be able to?
Yeah, I do. That
you can share?
Oh, sure. I'm writing a book about all this stuff, so it's all very current in my head. Dunlop had been working with Jaguar. Well, they had been working independently to develop a disc brake. And when it was developed, Briggs Cunningham found out about it, and he was right there. I want to buy them. And sadly, Dunlop gave the exclusive for X number of years to Jaguar because Jaguar represented a much larger universe of cars to sell them through than Briggs. Briggs's, rather minuscule amount of street cars and race cars represented a small piece of business compared to what Jaguar had with, hundreds or thousands of cars, both street cars and race cars. So the sad news is that Briggs was never able to get disc brakes for his cars. The good news, I guess you call it, is that after Briggs discontinued building his own cars in 1955, Jaguar gave him the Northeast United States distributorship for their cars. And so he operated that out of Alfred Momo's shops in Woodside, Queens on Long Island. And for years, he was a Jaguar distributor and dealer. So if there's any, if there's any good news to that, he became a dealership. But my car has disc brakes that cannot be identified. I'm sorry, has drum brakes that cannot be identified. When we refurbished this car mechanically, built all new hydraulics, master cylinder, went through the wheel cylinders, whatever. It has a drum brake, I think it's probably 11 inches in diameter, that's 3 inches wide, that we cannot cross-reference to any Chrysler or any Ford or any car of that era. And so I had to get the shoes relined with, I have a racing material lining on there now. The best that people are guessing is that it was a Cessna brake for a Cessna, some kind of Cessna aircraft.
Airplane.
That was adapted to my car. And I can't, debate that. I don't know, but if it's a car brake, it's a rare car brake. But he lost Le Mans, I believe, because of two reasons: lack of disc brake, lack of a small block.
Yeah. Just a specific from Stan, since it's all, and you kind of really touched on this, Chrysler suspension are there? You have the largely Chrysler, I guess you, yeah, front and rear. Any,
On my car, but other cars might have had more Mercury components on it. You know, if you think about it, Briggs Cunningham does not get credit for what he did. He built a car from the ground up. Carroll Shelby gets credit for building a Cobra, when in fact, Carroll Shelby took AC cars and put Ford engines in them, and that's it. All he did was put a different drivetrain into an already existing platform. But Briggs Cunningham built a car from the ground up. They welded the chassis. They put the drivetrain in. They had to source out windshield wipers and horn buttons and gauges and taillights. And, they had to source out all the things that Carroll Shelby gets credit for building. Briggs Cunningham's plant actually did build those things.
Yeah, I'll just add that this is Bill Sangre. One of the reasons we have an AC Bristol 6-cylinder in the display, because it is a 6-cylinder Hemi. But that car was what became the Cobra with a non-Hemi in it. It came with a small block Ford in it. But that and Tom's absolutely right on that AC Bristol that Shelby used. I guess that's it. If I missed any other questions, Tom, thank you very much to all. We'll see if we can, if Tom is going to be here himself. I'm not sure he is going to be actually picking the car up, but we'll let you know through the email.
I can confirm that yes, I will be there to pick up the car with my friend Keith, and we're bringing the car up to New England after that. So I have had both my COVID shots, Pfizer. By that time, I will have had the second shot for 2 months. So I would, I'll be there with a mask on, but I'd love to meet anybody that wants to come out, and I'll bore you to tears with more information about this car. And I'll let you sit. I'll let you sit in it.
Thanks, Tom. Hope to see you at Cotter.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of, we got out up here a couple of weeks ahead of time, and I stuffed it down in the detail shop and kept it covered up. And I think there were only 3 people knew what was under it, and I wouldn't tell anybody. And finally, I had to pull the cover off and bring it up when we opened the display. So I had the honor of sitting in the seat and putting it in gear, driving it a little bit. So, but it was my pleasure, and it's been my pleasure to do this. So, hey, we can book this thing on the 26th. That's the Monday after the show shuts down. And
how about on Sunday? Can we do it on Sunday?
Yeah, we can do it on Sunday. Sure.
Yeah, if I could pick it up on Sunday, that would
let me get back to you. And I think we can. We've got an event going on, a Matchbox car thing, but Stanley, you don't have any. Let's see. Let's say yes, we'll do it on Sunday. Bring the car out, but I'll have to work out the details on that. Okay.
All right. Sounds good.
Good. Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you all for participating. Tom, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I'm seeing some hands waving here. And
yep.
I hope you all enjoyed it. And we'll work on that Model T driving across the country. Do a Model T driving school here. So we might be able to do, I know we'll be able to do that somehow.
Yep.
Very good. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.